Ever walked into an old mechanic's garage and noticed there wasn't a single computer in sight? No fancy diagnostic scanners, no laser alignment tools, just a workbench covered in grease, a coffee can full of random bolts, and a guy who could tell what was wrong with your engine just by listening to it idle for 3 seconds. Back in the 1970s, mechanics didn't have the luxury of technology. What they had was something arguably better, pure ingenuity born from necessity. Today we're counting down 25 genius garage hacks that old-school mechanics swore by, and honestly, some of these are so clever, they'll make modern auto shops look a little embarrassing. If you're into this kind of stuff, smash that like button, subscribe, and let's get into it. Number 25. The bread trick for valve seal jobs. Here's one that sounds absolutely insane until you realize it's actually brilliant. When old mechanics needed to replace valve seals without pulling the entire cylinder head, they had a serious problem. The moment the valve spring came off, the valve would just drop straight down into the cylinder. Gone. And fishing it out meant tearing the whole top end apart. Their solution? Stuff the combustion chamber with plain white bread through the spark plug hole. Yes, bread. Regular sandwich bread. They'd crank the piston up close to the top of its stroke, feed compressed balls of white bread in through the plug hole, and it would pack in behind the valve, holding it firmly in place while they worked. Once the job was done, they'd pull the bread out, or just let the engine chew it up and blow the crumbs out the exhaust on startup. No harm done. This trick saved hours of labor and hundreds of dollars in head gasket replacement costs. Mechanics passed it down like a family heirloom, and some old-timers still insist it works better than the fancy valve spring compressor adapters you can buy today. Number 24. The rubber hose stethoscope. Forget expensive automotive stethoscopes. 70s mechanics grabbed a 3-foot length of rubber heater hose, stuck one end near a suspected noisy component, and held the other end right up to their ear. That's it. That was the whole tool. The hose would isolate and amplify the sound coming from a specific bearing, pulley, or accessory, filtering out the general engine noise around it. They could pinpoint a failing water pump, a dying alternator bearing, or a noisy hydraulic lifter in seconds flat. The trick was using a hose stiff enough to direct the sound, but flexible enough to snake around the tight spaces of an engine bay. Some guys kept a dedicated piece of heater hose hanging on a nail on the shop wall, specifically for diagnostic listening. It was so effective that even after proper mechanic stethoscopes became widely available and affordable, plenty of old-timers flatly refused to switch. Why spend money fixing something that isn't broken? Number 23. Coca-Cola as battery terminal cleaner. This one has been floating around for decades, and it got its real start in the 1970s. When battery terminals got caked with that crusty white and green corrosion buildup, mechanics would crack open a bottle of Coke and pour it right over the terminals. The phosphoric acid in the soda would fizz up dramatically and dissolve the corrosion in just a couple of minutes. Then they'd rinse it off with some water, dry the terminals, and coat them with a generous smear of petroleum jelly to prevent future buildup. The whole process cost about 15 cents and worked better than most commercial battery cleaners on the shelf. The real genius was how accessible it was. Every single gas station in America had a Coke machine sitting right out front. You didn't need a special trip to the auto parts store. You just needed some pocket change and a cold bottle of America's favorite soft drink pulling double duty as a surprisingly effective chemical cleaning agent. Number 22. The penny tire tread test. Tire tread depth gauges existed in the 70s, sure. But most mechanics didn't bother reaching for one. They just grabbed a penny. They'd stick Honest Abe's head upside down into the tire groove. If they could see the top of Lincoln's head poking out above the rubber, the tread was too shallow and the tire was done. If his head disappeared down into the groove, you still had plenty of life left. Simple, fast, and plenty accurate for everyday use. This little trick became one of the most widely taught car maintenance tips in American history. Driving instructors repeated it to every new student. Dads taught it to their teenagers getting their first car. And it all originated from grease-stained mechanics who figured out that a 1-cent coin was the perfect free measuring instrument. Some shops even kept a bowl of pennies sitting on the front counter, specifically for customer demonstrations. Number 21. The ATF and acetone penetrating fluid. Here's a cocktail recipe that never made it into any bartender's guide. Old mechanics discovered that mixing automatic transmission fluid with acetone in roughly a 50-50 ratio created a penetrating fluid that flat out embarrassed just about everything else on the market. Rusted bolts that laughed at expensive commercial spray cans would surrender after just a 20-minute soak in this homemade brew. The acetone would creep deep into microscopic cracks in the rust, carrying the transmission fluid lubricant right behind it into the threads. Multiple independent tests conducted over the years have actually confirmed that this simple mixture consistently outperforms many big-name brand penetrating oils. The secret was the acetone's incredible ability to carry the thin lubricant deep into spaces that thicker commercial products simply could not reach. Mechanics guarded this recipe like it was Grandma's secret chili formula, and honestly, it was probably more useful. Number 20. Heating seized bolts with a torch. When penetrating oil just wasn't getting the job done, 70s mechanics reached for the torch. A propane or acetylene flame applied directly to a seized, rusted bolt would cause the surrounding metal to expand from the heat, cracking and breaking the rust bond between the bolt and the component. The crucial detail was heating the nut or the surrounding metal, not the bolt shaft itself. As the outer metal expanded away from the bolt, it created just enough clearance for everything to break free. Experienced mechanics developed an intuitive feel for exactly how long to apply the heat. Too little and nothing happened. Too much and you risked warping threads, damaging rubber seals, or setting nearby grease on fire. It was a skill that genuinely took years to master, and watching a seasoned mechanic work a blue flame on a rusted exhaust manifold bolt was like watching a surgeon operate. Controlled, precise, and oddly satisfying to witness. Number 19. The vacuum gauge as an engine diagnostic tool. Before onboard computers told you everything with a dashboard light, a simple vacuum gauge was a mechanic's crystal ball. They'd connect it to an intake manifold vacuum port and read that needle like a fortune teller reads tea leaves. A steady reading around 18 to 22 inches of mercury at idle meant a healthy engine. A low but steady reading suggested retarded timing or a vacuum leak somewhere. A needle that slowly floated back and forth pointed to worn valve guides. A rhythmic, repeated drop indicated a burned or leaking valve. A rapid, erratic bounce could mean worn piston rings. One single tool, one gauge, and a mechanic who knew how to interpret the subtle dance of that needle could diagnose problems that would stump a modern technician armed with a $1,000 scan tool and 3 rounds of software updates. It was elegant, it was simple, and many old-timers still call it the single most useful diagnostic instrument ever invented. Number 18. The coat hanger exhaust patch. Exhaust systems in the 70s rusted out faster than you could say emissions test. Road salt, cheap steel, and minimal undercoating meant mufflers and tailpipes had the lifespan of a mayfly. When a pipe developed a hole or a joint cracked apart, mechanics didn't always rush to order replacement parts. They'd grab a wire coat hanger, straighten it out, and use it as makeshift baling wire to strap everything back together. For small holes, they'd wrap the hanger wire tightly around the pipe and use it to secure a patch made from an old tin can or scrap sheet metal over the damage. Slather on some exhaust repair paste, and this ugly little hack could buy a customer months of extra life out of a dying exhaust system. Was it pretty? Absolutely not. Did it pass close visual inspection? Not even slightly. Did it work? Way better than it had any right to. Number 17. Bar soap as an emergency leak sealer. Got a small crack in a radiator hose or a tiny weeping gasket that just won't stop dripping? Old mechanics had a trick that sounds way too primitive to actually work. They'd take a dry bar of soap, rub it firmly and directly over the leak, and let the heat and pressure of the running system push the soap into the crack. The soap would soften from the warmth, fill the gap, and create a temporary but surprisingly effective seal. This was never meant as a permanent repair, of course, but it absolutely could get a stranded car off the roadside and safely to a shop without calling for a tow truck. Some mechanics kept a bar of plain ivory soap in their toolboxes specifically for roadside emergency calls. The critical detail was using a basic, no-frills bar soap, nothing with moisturizers, lotions, or fancy additives. Just cheap, old-fashioned soap doing something its manufacturers never once imagined. Number 16. The Golf Tee fuel line plug. When a metal fuel line developed a pinhole leak from corrosion, 70s mechanics had a hilariously simple emergency fix. They'd grab a wooden golf tee, snap it down to the right length, and just tap it firmly into the hole with a small hammer. The soft wood would compress and form a tight seal against the metal, stopping the leak almost instantly. It was strictly a temporary field repair, meant to safely get the car to the shop, but some of those so-called temporary fixes lasted embarrassingly long. Weeks, sometimes months. The wood would actually swell slightly from contact with the gasoline, which ironically improved the seal over time. Mechanics who worked near golf courses always seemed to have a pocket full of teas, and it wasn't necessarily because they were sneaking in 9 holes during their lunch break. Well, okay, maybe sometimes, but mostly it was because those little wooden pegs were genuinely handy emergency repair tools. Number 15. Chalk for reading gear contact patterns. Setting up ring and pinion gears in a differential requires knowing precisely where the gear teeth are making contact with each other. Get it wrong, and you'll burn up an expensive gear set in 1,000 miles. Modern shops use specialized gear marking compound. 70s mechanics used sidewalk chalk. They'd coat the ring gear teeth with a thin, even layer of chalk, then rotate the pinion gear through the mesh a few times by hand. The contact pattern would show up as a perfectly clear impression pressed into the chalk, instantly revealing whether the gears were set too deep, too shallow, or sitting in the sweet spot. Different colors of chalk on dark metal made patterns even easier to read. Cheap, available at any hardware store, and worked perfectly. Number 14. The double nut technique for removing broken studs. A snapped stud with no head left to grip is one of the most blood pressure raising situations in all of mechanical work. Old mechanics solved it elegantly with nothing but 2 standard nuts. They'd thread both nuts onto the remaining exposed stud, then tighten them firmly against each other using 2 wrenches. This jammed them together on the stud, effectively creating a brand new bolt head out of thin air. Then they'd just put a socket on the lower nut and back the whole broken stud right out of the hole. The friction between the 2 jam nuts held everything together tightly enough to transfer serious torque without slipping. No special stud extractors needed, no drilling, no expensive easy-out bits that might snap off inside the hole and turn a bad day into a catastrophic one. Just 2 cheap nuts, a wrench, and a mechanic who understood how friction and leverage worked together. Number 13. Plain transmission. Fluid as penetrating oil. Before the famous ATF and acetone cocktail became widely known, mechanics discovered something interesting. Plain, ordinary automatic transmission fluid all by itself was a surprisingly effective penetrating oil for rusted fasteners. The combination of detergent additives and the naturally thin viscosity of ATF allowed it to creep into incredibly tight spaces and break down corrosion better than many products specifically marketed and priced for that exact job. Mechanics would liberally soak a rusted bolt overnight with nothing but cheap transmission fluid, and by the next morning it would often break free without a fight. Some shops bought the cheapest generic ATF available in bulk quantities, and not a drop of it was going into transmissions. It all went straight onto rusty parts bins for overnight soaking. It was a hidden-in-plain-sight solution that made you wonder why anyone bothered paying premium prices for specialty penetrants. Number 12. The mirror on a stick. This one is so simple, it barely even qualifies as a hack, but it was absolutely indispensable in every 70s garage. Old mechanics kept a small mirror mounted on an extendable telescoping handle for peering at the backsides of engines, up underneath dashboards, and into any space too cramped or awkward for a human head to fit. Before fiber optic borescopes and wireless inspection cameras, this was literally the only way to see what was happening behind an intake manifold or underneath a transmission bell housing without disassembling half the car. Some creative mechanics rigged small pen lights to the handle for illuminated viewing. Others bent coat hangers into custom mirror mounts for specific recurring jobs. The fanciest version was a telescoping dental mirror. The cheapest was a shard of broken mirror glued to a dowel rod. Both worked about equally well. Number 11. Hand-cut cardboard gaskets. When a gasket blew on a Saturday afternoon and the parts store was either closed or didn't have the right replacement in stock. Old mechanics didn't sit around waiting for a Monday morning special order. They made their own. Using a sheet of proper gasket material or in a pinch even thick cardboard, they'd place it over the mating surface of the component and tap carefully around all the edges and bolt holes with a ball-peen hammer. The sharp rim of each bolt hole and the edges of the casting would cut the gasket material like a cookie cutter, producing a custom-fit gasket in just a few minutes. Every bolt hole, every oil passage, every coolant jacket, all perfectly placed. Some mechanics preferred to lay the old blown gasket on top of new material as a tracing template and cut it out with heavy scissors or a razor blade. Either method worked. The skill of hand-making gaskets was considered fundamental, non-negotiable knowledge in every single 70s repair shop. Number 10. Jumper wire bypass diagnostics. When an electrical component stopped working, 70s mechanics did not have the luxury of plugging in a scan tool and reading stored fault codes off a screen. They used jumper wires. A simple length of wire with alligator clips crimped onto each end could bypass switches, relays, fuses, and connections to systematically isolate the source of the problem. If the fuel pump was dead, they'd run a jumper wire feeding power directly from the battery to the pump. If it roared to life, the pump itself was fine, and the fault was somewhere upstream in the wiring or the relay circuit. If it stayed silent, the pump was dead and needed replacement. This logical, systematic elimination approach, powered by nothing more than a piece of wire and clear thinking, was how entire electrical systems got diagnosed. A skilled electrical mechanic could trace and fix wiring problems faster with a test light and a jumper wire than many modern technicians can manage with a $1,000 scan tool. Number 9. Filing and gapping distributor points. Electronic ignition systems didn't become standard equipment across the industry until the mid to late 1970s, which meant the vast majority of cars on the road still ran on mechanical breaker points inside the distributor. These small contact surfaces would gradually pit, corrode, and build up residue over time, eventually causing misfires, rough idle, hard cold starting, and poor fuel economy. A good mechanic always carried a small ignition point file in his shirt pocket, the same way a doctor carries a pen. A few quick, careful strokes across both contact faces would clean them up bright and restore a clean, crisp spark. The real skill came in setting the point gap afterward, typically around 15 thousandths of an inch. using a feeler gauge blade slipped between the contacts. A perfectly filed and precisely gapped set of points could make a tired engine run like new. Number 8. Cracking an egg in the radiator. This one sounds like pure backyard folklore, but old-school mechanics genuinely did this, and it genuinely worked. When a radiator developed a small internal leak and a proper repair wasn't immediately possible, some mechanics would crack a single raw egg into the radiator through the filler neck and let the engine run up to operating temperature. As the hot coolant circulated through the system, the egg white would cook, solidify, and congeal right around the point where the leak was pulling coolant out. It would effectively plug the hole with cooked protein. Was it elegant engineering? Not remotely. Was it endorsed by any car manufacturer in human history? Not a chance. Did it get countless stranded motorists home safely from the middle of nowhere? Absolutely. The critical trick was restraint. One egg only. Crack 2 or 3 in there. And you risked clogging the heater core, which would create an entirely new and expensive problem. Number 7. Cigarette smoke as a vacuum leak detector. Back in an era when practically everyone smoked and ashtrays came standard in every car, mechanics naturally found automotive uses for their cigarettes. To locate elusive vacuum leaks, a mechanic would take a long, deep drag and then slowly, deliberately blow the smoke around intake manifold gaskets, vacuum hose connections, and the carburetor base gasket area. Wherever the smoke suddenly got pulled inward and vanished, that was your leak. The engine's intake vacuum would literally inhale the smoke right at the leak point, making an otherwise invisible problem completely obvious to the naked eye. It was crude. It was definitely not healthy. And it worked incredibly well. Some more inventive mechanics eventually built dedicated smoke-generating devices using rubber tubing and small aquarium air pumps to produce a steady, controlled stream of smoke without having to personally inhale anything in the process. Those homemade contraptions were the direct ancestors of the professional EVAP smoke testing machines used in modern repair shops today. Number 6. Baling wire for absolutely everything. If wire coat hangers were the duct tape of 70s garages, then baling wire was the super glue, the zip ties, and the prayer all rolled into one. This thin, flexible steel wire was originally manufactured for bundling hay bales on farms, but it migrated into every mechanic's shop across the country. Broken exhaust hanger rattling against the floor, baling wire, loose heat shield buzzing at highway speed, baling wire, throttle return spring snapped 30 miles from the nearest town. Baling wire. Mechanics would twist it, loop it, braid it, and weave it into creative solutions for problems that technically required actual replacement parts. The appeal was its incredible versatility. It was strong enough to bear meaningful loads, flexible enough to wrap around almost anything, heat-resistant under the car, and so cheap that nobody thought twice about using 10 feet of it on a 5-cent repair. Number 5. Grease pencil. Marks for setting ignition timing. Getting ignition timing dialed in correctly was absolutely critical for engine performance, fuel economy, and longevity, and 70s mechanics had the process refined to an art form. They'd aim a timing light at the harmonic balancer marks while the engine idled, watching the strobe freeze the spinning pulley in place. But the real hack was all in the preparation work, a bright white or yellow grease pencil mark drawn right on the timing notch in the balancer made it infinitely easier to spot under the rapid strobe flash of the timing light in a dim engine bay. Some mechanics went even further and painted the entire timing scale tab on the engine block with white paint so that every single degree mark stood out clearly against the dark cast iron. The combination of clean, visible timing marks and a steady timing light was the difference between an engine that purred smoothly and one that pinged and knocked under load. Number 4. Freezing parts to install. Press-fit bearings. Interference-fit components like wheel bearings, wrist pin bushings, and transmission bearing races require extremely precise installation. They're designed to be slightly larger than the hole they go into, which means forcing them in with brute strength risks damaging delicate surfaces. Old mechanics understood basic thermal physics. Metal contracts when it gets cold and expands when it gets hot. So they'd toss a new bearing in the shop freezer overnight or pack it in dry ice for a couple of hours, shrinking its outside diameter just enough to slip it cleanly into its housing by hand without the need for a hydraulic press. Sometimes they'd simultaneously heat the housing with a torch to expand it. The bearing would then warm to ambient temperature and expand into a perfect, rock-solid press fit. This thermal trick eliminated the need for expensive pressing equipment and dramatically reduced the risk of damaging delicate bearing surfaces during installation. Number 3. Soapy water spray for finding any kind of leak. Before electronic refrigerant sniffers and ultrasonic leak detectors, 70s mechanics relied on perhaps the simplest diagnostic method in the entire history of mechanical repair. They'd mix a few squirts of ordinary dish soap with water in a spray bottle and spritz it generously over any area suspected of leaking air or gas. Wherever bubbles formed and grew, that was your leak, plain as day. This beautifully simple technique worked on tires, exhaust systems, intake manifold gaskets, brake vacuum lines, air conditioning systems pressurized with shop air, and just about anything else that was supposed to hold pressure, but wasn't. The beauty of this method was its completely unambiguous visual confirmation. You didn't need to interpret an oscillating gauge reading or strain to hear a faint hiss over shop noise. You just watched for bubbles. It was so fundamentally reliable that even today, surrounded by thousands of dollars in sophisticated electronic diagnostic equipment, many experienced technicians still reach for a spray bottle of soapy water as their first diagnostic step. Number 2. The flat rate speed hack culture. Flat rate pay was the compensation system where mechanics earned a fixed dollar amount per job based on a published labor time guide, regardless of how long the work actually took them. Finish a 2-hour book job in 45 minutes and you still got paid for 2 hours. Take 3 hours on it and you just lost money. This system accidentally created an entire underground culture of brilliant efficiency hacks and optimized procedures that were passed from veteran to apprentice like trade secrets. Mechanics discovered that removing a seemingly unrelated component first could dramatically improve access and cut total job time in half. They figured out which specific tool combinations eliminated unnecessary steps from factory procedures. They learned exactly which bolts could stay loosened instead of fully removed, which plastic clips could be popped and reused without breaking, and which steps in the official service manual were completely unnecessary padding. These were not lazy shortcuts that compromised quality. They were refined, battle-tested, efficiency improvements developed through thousands of repetitions of the same jobs over years and decades. Number 1. Diagnosing everything by sound alone. And here it is. The number 1 garage hack that no scan tool, no software update, and no amount of modern technology has ever truly been able to replace. Old 70s mechanics could diagnose engine and drivetrain problems by sound alone. A faint metallic tick at idle. Exhaust manifold leak at the gasket. A rhythmic, deep knock that got louder with engine speed. Connecting rod bearing on its way out. A high-pitched squeal on cold morning startup that faded after 30 seconds. Glazed accessory drive belt. A hollow thudding sound under heavy acceleration. Piston slap from worn cylinder walls. A whining noise that changed pitch with vehicle speed but not engine speed. Differential bearing getting tired. They didn't just hear these sounds with their ears. They felt them through their fingertips pressed against the fender, through vibrations traveling up through the shop floor into their boots, through decades of standing shoulder-deep in engine bays and learning the mechanical language that every engine speaks. This wasn't a skill you could pick up from a textbook or a 10-minute tutorial. It was earned knowledge, built slowly over years of grease-stained hands and thousands of engines telling their stories to anyone with enough patience and experience to truly listen. Modern diagnostics are incredible, no question about it. But there was something almost magical about watching an old mechanic pop your hood, tilt his head, listen for 10 quiet seconds, and tell you exactly what was failing and how long you had before it got serious. That deep mechanical intuition was the greatest garage hack ever developed, and that wraps it up. 25 genius garage hacks straight out of the 1970s. Some of them were crude, some of them were brilliant, and honestly, most of them were both at the same time. These guys didn't have YouTube tutorials or online forums to search through. They had hard-won experience, relentless creativity, and a stubborn refusal to let any problem beat them. Which one of these hacks surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments below, and if your dad or granddad was one of these old-school wrench turners, give this video a like in their honor. Hit subscribe and tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.